Good morning and welcome to the 36th and final meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. Can I remind people who are attending this morning to switch off mobile phones, Blackberries, etc. In saying that, you may also have noticed that there are members using iPads and tablets to access their papers for the meeting this morning. The first item on the agenda today is subordinate legislation. I have one affirmative instrument before us. The Health Board's Membership Elections Scotland Order 2013. As usual with affirmative instruments, we will have an evidence-taking session with the Cabinet Secretary and his officials on the instrument. And once we have had all our questions answered, we will then have the formal debate on the motion. Can I, in turn, welcome MCNEIL, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing. Welcome, Cabinet Secretary. Robert Kirkwood, Corporate Business Manager, NHS Scotland. And David Wilson, Solicitor, Food, Health and Community Care, Scottish Government. Welcome to you all. Can I have you prepared for a brief statement, Cabinet Secretary? Yes, that would be welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. The Draft Health Board's Membership and Elections Scotland Order 2013, which is before the committee today, will, if approved by the Parliament, revoke the pilot order made under the Health Board's Membership and Elections Scotland Act 2009. That order led to the piloting of Health Board elections in Fife and Dumfries and Galloway Health Board areas in 2010. In taking this policy forward with Parliament following the 2007 election, we sought to address the levels of participation and engagement between boards and the communities they serve. After an extensive consultation, we worked with others in this Parliament and took forward legislation that allowed the piloting of direct elections. As part of that original legislation, we also agreed with Parliament that a robust process should be put in place to ensure that no rollout of the pilot could take place without proper consideration. These measures included the requirement for the pilot scheme to be independently evaluated, giving a vital independent view of the impact of the pilot. Secondly, the pilot would have to last for at least 2 years before any evaluation reported, ensuring that the pilot had an appropriate time to become established before any judgment was made. And thirdly, there could only be one pilot. This would avoid any moves to continue to change and modify board structures, which could prove an unhelpful distraction. The election count took place on 10th June 2010, and from 60 candidates in Fife and 70 candidates in Dumfries and Galloway, 12 and 10 members respectively were returned to each health board. In December 2012, 2.5 years after the elections took place, the independent evaluation carried out by the London School of Economics, working with the University of St Andrews, was published. And looking at that evaluation, it became clear that, to me, after a period of time, that we should not continue with rolling out the programme. We also carried out alternative pilots at the same time as the Dumfries and Galloway and Fife election pilots, and these alternative pilots were successful in attracting a far greater number of applicants from different spectrums and demographics of Scottish society than those under the system that operated previously. For example, in Grampian, we received 90 applications for the appointments. This compared with the 8 applications we received under the previous process. Building on the success of the alternative pilots, many of the approaches that were used have been replicated by other boards during their own appointment rounds. The increase in the diversity of appointments to health boards will contribute to better participation and engagement, and it's my intention to build upon the successes of the alternative pilot approach and continue to encourage boards to be more flexible and inclusive in their approach to appointments. And for the reasons outlined, I believe we should not roll out the health board elections and thereby, under the terms of the legislation, terminate the pilots accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now move for questions. I see Aileen McLeod, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, obviously, there's a couple of questions I would like to ask as a member of the South of Scotland, and obviously Dumfries and Galloway is part and parcel of the South of Scotland. And it's just primarily around the costs of the elections that were held to, obviously, in NHS, Dumfries and Galloway, primarily around just what the costings were and how much it would also have cost in terms of trying to roll out the Health Board elections across all the Health Board areas in Scotland?
The cost of the pilots was of the order of £2.5 million, but to roll it out, the independent evaluation estimated it would cost £12 million. Now, we actually think that's an underestimate, because if you look at the cost of the local elections in Scotland last year, they cost between 16 to £20 million, depending on what you include in the cost. So we actually believe the £12 million estimate is quite an underestimate, but even at £12 million, quite frankly, that money would have had to have come out of the health and social care budget. And my view is that there are higher priorities for £12 million than rolling out direct elections to health boards.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The other question was just around in terms of the governance arrangements that will be put in place. We just ask when you think you'll be appointing new non-executives onto the Pilot Health Board, and how many members you think there'll be? Well,
early in the new year, we'll be starting the process of advertising for new members for Fife and for Dumfries and Galloway, because obviously I always want to ensure that there are significantly more non-executive members of the board than there are executive members of the board, and therefore I'm anxious to ensure that we move reasonably quickly in the new year to do that. But we will be taking into account, obviously, the experience elsewhere, particularly in Grampian and Lothian, and the exercise that's going on currently in NHS Lanarkshire to deliberately try to recruit a more diverse spectrum of people onto the health board, and in particular the current exercise in Lanarkshire, where we have very specifically advertised for underrepresented groups on the health board, like women, like ethnic minority groups, like the disabled. That has proved quite successful in terms of the number of applications, and we believe that we will be able to fill those two positions in Lanarkshire with underrepresented groups. And therefore, when we come to advertise the positions in Fife and Dumfries and Galloway, I want to use the opportunity to make sure that underrepresented groups within society are encouraged to stand, and provided they're up to the job, make sure that they are appointed to the board.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Following on from that, I think I heard you in the Chamber last week talk about this and say that the people that had been directly elected obviously come off the boards at the end of this month. If I'm hearing you right, then you are advertising to replace them starting next month. How long do you think the gap will be between their leaving and new appointments being made?
Well, the usual kind of time frame is 2 months to recruit new people from the time we advertise the positions to appointments, so it will be done timiously and speedily. It so happens we still have a good complement of members in both those boards, so it's not as if we're down to the last half dozen members or anything like that. Both boards are sufficiently well staffed up in terms of board membership, but I want to make sure, as I said, it's not just about the number of people on the board, it's about the balance, particularly between executive and non-executive members, and I'm keen to ensure that there's always a very strong preference, strong majority for non-executive members.
On that, can I then ask why maybe you didn't decide to run the elected members up until they would be replaced by the appointed members that you're now advertising for? Why leave a gap?
Actually, a lot of this is about the terms of the legislation, because basically under the terms of the bill that was passed by the Parliament, I've basically had to take a decision and to lay this order. Otherwise, I would have been duty-bound under the legislation to rerun the elections in Fife and Dumfries and Galloway in 2014, and that's where the timing issue has come in. So I've run actually and allowed them to serve as long as I could under the terms of the legislation, but the legislation doesn't allow me to continue with that beyond the laying of this order.
Sorry, Convener, just possibly one final question. Could it then have been that the appointments would have been advertised earlier to allow the appointments to be made at the end of this month to to prevent a gap.
Presumptuous of me to predetermine what the Parliament's decision in this matter was, obviously, because I give respect to the Parliament. It may well be the Parliament decides not to agree with me and not pass this order, in which case I would have spent a lot of money advertising positions that I couldn't then fill.
Could you not have taken the order to the Parliament a bit sooner, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Well, if I'd done that, the period of office would have come to an end, at the time of the order, once the order is in effect. So I felt this was the best timing, and I don't see any significant gap in terms of the period of time from when the elected members demit office to when new recruited members will take office. And as I say, both boards are not in a position where they are short of board members.
So what you're saying is, sorry, just to clarify in my own mind, what you're saying is that the moment the order is passed, then they cease to be members. You couldn't have put a date in the order or put the order to Parliament, having it come into power 2 months hence to allow that space.
Well,
is there any way you can...
I also wanted to make sure that the elected members, because they did go through an election and they have served for a period of time, so I didn't want to cut short their period unnecessarily because I felt a bit duty-bound, and, obviously some of them I would anticipate would reapply for board membership under the normal procedure.
I don't think you're quite understanding what I'm driving at. What I'm driving at is not cutting short. Or are you telling me there has to be a 2-month gap regardless because of the way the legislation is set?
Well, the way the legislation is working, the way the legislation is worded to, and both the legislation, the way it's worded, has to be done according to the legislation the way I've outlined. If I'd brought the order forward earlier, then I think that would have created a period of uncertainty because even although I'd put a date on, let's say I'd brought this order 6 months ago and I'd said in the order that the members could continue to serve until the turn of the year, say, the authority of those members would have been grossly undermined, obviously. So I wanted as much as possible to bring the order to the kind of latest date I possibly could reasonably, so that we didn't undermine the authority of those board members while they're serving.
This isn't a surprise to them.
Well, I don't think it should be. I mean, anyone who reads the evaluation, I think, certainly anyone I've spoken to in the health service, irrespective of whether they're board members or whether they're other roles in the health service, I think there is a universal view out there that if you've got £12 million to spend, it's far better to spend it on service provision rather than rolling out elections.
Chisholm.
I apologise, I haven't read the evaluation, but I'm not here to oppose what you're suggesting, but I think it would be interesting to know what other lessons you've learned from this experience. I mean, obviously you've presented the financial objection to continuing with this, but clearly it was, I was going to say almost a flagship policy. It was certainly a major policy plank that you advocated in the past. So I'm not criticising people from changing their minds, but I would just like to know in what other ways it didn't really fulfil your expectations, I suppose.
Well, as I say, first of all, in terms of the underrepresented groups on boards, the alternative pilots actually did a better job in that. I mean, I am determined to get more women onto NHS boards. I'm determined to get more disabled people onto NHS boards. I'm determined to get more ethnic minority representatives onto NHS boards. And that didn't happen. Secondly, the turnout in the elections, particularly the 10% turnout, was very, very disappointing, and I think makes it questionable as to how reflective the election was of public opinion. The third thing is, and I noticed this myself in some of the decisions that have arisen, and I don't want to go in particularly to a lot of detail on this, but one of my concerns, which wasn't actually highlighted in the evaluation, is that when people are elected, where there's a big geographical area, and both Fife and Dumfries and Galloway are fairly significant geographical areas, candidates who maybe live in one part of the area and are elected on the back of support from their own locality, when they go on the board, I think sometimes see it as their role to fight for resources for their area rather than looking at the big picture of the total board area. Now, I'm sure you would be the first to agree, Malcolm, as a former Minister of Health, we cannot risk the balkanisation of health boards. And people, you know, if you're from Glenrothes, thinking that you're there to represent Glenrothes, you're not. You're there to represent the board area in its entirety, and the whole point is you have to look at the big picture in terms of the entire Fife area, or Dumfries and Galloway area, Lanarkshire area. And I think that one of the other things that I've noticed since the evaluation, in the 15 months I've been in this job, creeping in is the possibility of people taking a very different view and seeing themselves as being there to represent a particular locality rather than to look at the big picture in terms of the overall board position. Now, even without that, I think the right decision is not to go ahead with rolling out these elections, but that is another reason why I believe this is the right decision.
That's really interesting. I mean, I don't think the fundamental reason was to get underrepresented groups on the board. I suppose it was seen at the time by some people as an answer to the vexed problem of meaningful public involvement in health decisions. So if this hasn't proved to be the kind of panacea that some people thought it would be, have you developed other forms of improving public involvement in health decisions?
I'll give you a two-pronged answer to that. First of all, we are obviously, as I've already said, using the lessons learned from the alternative models in alternative pilots in Grampian and in Lothian, and what's going on in Lanarkshire in cooperation with the Scottish Public Appointments Commissioner, which is very deliberately designed to ensure that we get underrepresented groups on the board of NHS Lanarkshire. But the second point is, I believe that in any case, we need to look at ways of improving both the governance and the accountability of the health boards. And we also need to take account of the implications of the integration agenda in terms of public accountability and the shift within health board areas of responsibilities to the new partnerships. And I'll be issuing a consultation document early in the new year on ways to improve the governance and accountability of health boards in Scotland.
Okay, thank you.
Annette Millen.
Covered by Rhoda Grant. Okay. Thank you.
If there are no other questions, then I'll proceed to agenda item number 2, which is a formal debate on the affirmative SSI, in which we have just taken evidence. Can I remind members that they should not put questions to the Cabinet Secretary at this point? This is a debate, and that, of course, the officials may not speak in the debate. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S4M 8580?
So move, Convener.
Thank you. Do I have any members who wish to contribute to the debate? No. Then can we put the question then? That the question is that the Health and Sport Committee recommend that Health Board's membership in Elections Scotland Order 2013 draft be approved. Agreed. Thank you. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary's official for their attendance and wish them a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And
can I reciprocate, Convener, and wish yourself and the committee all the best of the season, and to say that I hope that Santa Claus will be good to each and every one of them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We just suspend at this point just for till we. Agenda item number 3, which is further consideration of subordinate legislation, this time 4 negative instruments. The first is SSI 2013-327, National Health Service Travelling Expenses Remission of Charges, Scotland, number 2. There has been no motion to annul, and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has not made any comments on the instrument. I don't know whether I've got any comments from the committee. No. Therefore, I'll put the question on SSI 2013-327 that the committee has no recommendations to make. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Now, the second consideration is SSI 2013-333, Food Safety, Food Hygiene and Official Controls, Sprouting Seeds Scotland Regulations 2013. There has been no motion to annul, and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has not made any comments on the instrument. Are there any comments from the members? No. I therefore put the question on SSI 2013-333 that the committee has no recommendations to make. Are we all agreed? Thank you. And the third SSI is SSI 2013-334, Health Board's Membership Scotland Regulations 2013. There has been no motion to annul. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has drawn the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on the general reporting ground. The details, of course, are in Annex B of your papers on page 10 and 11. Is there any comment from members? At this point, no. I'll therefore put the question on SSI 2013-334 that the committee has no recommendations to make. Are we all agreed? Thank you. The fourth SSI is SSI 2013-336, Food Miscellaneous Amendments, Scotland Regulations 2013. There has been no motion to annul, and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has not made any comments on the instrument. Are there any comments that members wish to make? Nanette Millen.
It's maybe a very ignorant question. What is a legomorph?
A legomorph.
Doesn't anyone know?
we are
Oh, well.
I know what it used to mean, but it was...
It's all right.
Laid them off on a Friday when there was no work.
We'll write back to you and let you know. We can always write back to them and let them know.
It's obviously something that produces meat, but I don't know. Anyway. Thank you.
Have we got any? No? Scrambling. A bit of notice in that one would have been appreciated, and it saved a lot of red faces. We'll move on. Apart from that comment, is there any other comments? Therefore, we'll move to we move on then to SSI 2013-336. If the committee has no recommendation to make, are we all agreed? Thank you. That concludes our consideration of subordinate legislation today, and we now move on to item number 4, which is to consider legislative consent memorandum, or LCM. In your papers, you will find the Scottish Government's memorandum, a draft of the motion and explanation of the LCM. The committee could decide to take evidence in this, but we might take the view that on this occasion, the legislation being passed by the UK Parliament is so minor that we don't need to carry out any further scrutiny and can simply recommend the Parliament the LCM be accepted or agreed. Are there any comments from members? Okay. Then, if the committee is agreed to recommend to the Parliament the legislation consent motion on the UK Care Bill be approved, is that agreed? Thank you. Can I suspend briefly while we invite our panel to to the table. We now reconvene and move to agenda item number 5, which is to consider a petition PE 1466, which was referred to us by the Public Petitions Committee earlier this year. The information that we have is in your SPICE briefing papers. Can I welcome the witnesses to give evidence to the petition? Can we welcome the petitioner, William Tate, Councillor Peter Johnson, COSLA, spokesperson for Health and Wellbeing, GARRICK SMYTH, Policy Manager, COSLA, John Campbell, Service Manager, Financial Inclusion, North Lanarkshire Council, and Ian Hood, Coordinator, Learning Disability Alliance. Can I welcome you all to our committee this morning? At this point, I would like to offer William Tate an opportunity as a petitioner to make some opening remarks. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Tate.
As brief as possible, but I thought it might be useful if I ran through a process which I believe happens, and then after that process has been set out, I'm open to questions. This initially started because of a personal incident with my autistic daughter, but as events developed, it made me believe that what was happening to us was happening throughout Scotland. And charges, etc., I believed could be a postcode lottery, that somebody with the same disability and same circumstances could be paying more in Edinburgh than in Aberdeen because of interpretation. And therefore I then thought, when you have an exchange with the council and it may become fraught, there is actually nowhere to go during that exchange to get help, support or intervention. You just have to stay on that merry-go-round until it stops, and then you get off, probably somewhat bedraggled and bewildered. COSLA, I believe, is an excellent organisation, and I have to be very thankful to Garrick, who invited me through eventually to talk with him. But that made me even more certain that I believe COSLA should be an independent body and not a body made up of councils. Because if it's a body that's made up of councils, then it becomes a situation of it's my ball and it's my rules. And unless you've got both parties inputting to rules, I suggest you're always going to have a bias. And therefore I think COSLA should be an independent body, making their own Bible and policing that, the use of that. The SPSO, I'm sure, is a credible body, but they don't intervene, and I put it until the patient's dead. SPSO don't intervene until everything's at an end, and they're looking at a complaint is very much procedural. And therefore, within 3,000 complaints they get a year, they uphold less than 100. And I don't believe the quality of complaint is so poor that you get such a terrible odds. And I think SPSO should have a different remit, and they should have inspectors who you can phone up during an event and they go in, they put everything into abeyance until they investigate and then see what happens after that. Because within the council system, you have monitoring officers. And I have sent through FOI emails to a number of councils to ask their profile of a monitoring officer. And it goes from very poor to not much better. You've also got advocates in the community, Seritas, Carers Link, etc. With the particular item that raised this, the advocates were very nice, very helpful, but all they said is, we don't understand a thing, and if it goes to appeal, we'll come and we'll hold your hand and keep you company, but we can't contribute. Now, if they're there to fill in forms or they're there to hand out forms, that's fine. But if they're there to go that step beyond, then their product knowledge should be much better. You're open to appeals within the council. I believe there are now 2 appeals through the Ombudsman's efforts. But when I wrote this, it was 3 appeals. But they were really quite farcical. Because the first appeal is with an employee of the council in the department that you're complaining about. What chance have you got of your appeal being upheld? The second appeal was basically the same, and the third appeal was supposed to be independent. Independent as much as it had an independent chairman who often worked with the council. But you had an independent chairman, and then you had 2 other members of that independent panel who weren't independent because they were employees of the council. So you have no chance, I suggest, in doing that. And why I say COSLA should be writing their own Bible and policing it, because that then stops councils doing pick and mix. I'll take that disregard, I'll disregard that disregard, etc. That's why you get a postcode lottery. And there was a disabled person in Somerset, took Somerset Council to court in London and won the case. And the court asked Somerset Council to go and re-evaluate all the charges they'd set on people, because they said when a council sets up a charge against a disabled person, they must take account of the costs that are related to that disability. And councils don't up here. And let me give you an example of what the court said. If a disabled person goes on holiday, the cost of that person going on holiday should not be disregarded, because it's a cost that you and I all have. But because they have to take a carer, that cost has to be disregarded, because it's a cost related to the disability. So I'm really here to say, I think COSLA could do a wonderful job as an independent body, create their own Bible, police it, and make sure it's being equally treated in councils throughout Scotland. And I think the Ombudsman would be far better equipped if they had a different remit, and you could phone them up during a difficulty, and they would go phone a council up and say, put everything in abeyance, we're sending somebody in to inspect this. Because it's not fair that people of all disabilities, all mental abilities, are put onto this merry-go-round, and frankly, you can't get off it until the councils push the button. And that's, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Tate. Before I asked for questions from committee members, is there anyone from COSLA would not necessarily at this point directly respond to everything that Mr. Tate said, but you know the general evidence that's speak to the written evidence? Would Mr. Johnson, you happy to do that? Just to briefly, before we go to questions, to get a balance so we can ask questions from both sides from the committee's point of view. Thanks, Councillor Johnson.
Well, can I thank Mr Tate for his very welcome, positive comments about COSLA, but I'm not clear how COSLA could exist as it's a convention of Scottish local authorities without its membership being local authorities. Having said that, I think the first thing we'd like to say is that COSLA believes absolutely that because each local authority has to design and deliver non-residential social care charges within different geographic, demographic and socio-economic circumstances, that local decision-making is by far the best way to deliver these services and to look to have a situation where it's local decision-making that determines whether charges, if any, should be levied. I think that's fairly fundamental to this. COSLA produces, as I'm sure colleagues will be aware, guidance to our membership, to local authorities, on how they should approach charges, and that's set out in our annual document. I think it's summed up in what is described as the panel approach, participation, where we look to involve our local communities in co-production, accountability for the charging regime, and one of the clear levels of accountability that Mr Tate didn't pick up on in his individual circumstances would be, of course, he has the opportunity to go to his elected member to represent him throughout this process. So it's not just a case of a faceless bureaucracy. He has the opportunity to involve a local elected member throughout the process if he's dissatisfied with what his local authority are doing. So the approach taken by COSLA is participation, accountability, non-discrimination and equality. We look to ensure that whatever charges are levied are fair and equitable. Empowerment of individuals to ensure that they are able to engage throughout this process. And legality, of course, we have to follow the rules, the law. That is an approach which COSLA takes very seriously, and I believe our member local authorities take very seriously. And we also look to review this process. Since 2002, and colleagues will be aware, it was the 2002 Community Care and Health Act which introduced free personal care and included powers in this respect. Since 2002, the guidance which COSLA has issued has been reviewed at least 5 times, and we are actively engaged as we speak in further reviews, and we do that through engaging, as Mr Tate has quite rightly said, through engaging with local communities, key stakeholders, and we're not looking to say we've got things perfect. We're absolutely willing to pick up on any thoughts on how we can improve the situation, but we would be very strongly opposed to anything in terms of regulation of charges at a national level. We would argue that would limit the power of local authorities to prioritise resources to meet local need, that it would limit innovation and creative solutions, and it would restrict the ability of local authorities to tailor services according to local circumstances, which we believe is fundamental. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. Actually, in some of the comments that Mr Johnson has just made has answered some of the questions I'm going to ask, but you know, the point that Mr Taton, morning Mr Taton, I'm sorry you've went through a process that you feel very aggrieved at, but you know, the fact that Councillor Johnson has just made, you know, COSLA is the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, and COSLA only survives because Scottish local authorities pay a subscription to COSLA, and COSLA is a meeting point for council leaders and councillors to discuss things. In regards to your petition, can I ask you what actually, and I don't want to know where you stay, but can I ask you what council that you actually, what council area you're in?
Eastern Barton.
Eastern Barton. In regards to their policy, do you feel, in order to ensure that your complaint is being looked at and taking on board the points that Councillor Johnson has just made, whilst respecting the factor that local councils should have autonomy and should be allowed to make their own decisions, do you believe that it should be a national policy?
I think there should be a policy which generates greater fairness, and this policy as it stands doesn't do that. And the fact that COSLA wish to not alter doesn't mean that they shouldn't if it's going to make it fairer, because I'm not talking about this on my personal circumstances. I'm talking about this broader and the Scottish people. And with respect to this House here, this meeting, I've involved MPs, I've involved councillors. They don't stay the course. I think if a benefit has to be calculated on XYZ formula, it's only fair that that XYZ formula is the same throughout Scotland. Otherwise, it is a postcode lottery. And it can be that that XYZ formula can be embellished by some councils. But the very minimum that we should all be getting in Scotland is that the XYZ formula is used and not adjusted to suit the council. And I think that's very wrong. And the pick and mix policy shouldn't be allowed to happen. And it is happening. And I have examples that it's happening.
Mr. Tate, the pick and mix approach.
Yes, see, my daughter was asked for an additional charge. And if that charge had gone through, she literally would have been made bankrupt in 9 months, because they wanted to reduce her income by 30% and her expenses by 25%. But that was bad enough. But the calculation didn't take heed of a disregard that COSLA said should have been taken heed of. And therefore, by that pick and mix approach, it actually increased the amount of money they wanted from my daughter. And if they had taken the guidelines and taken the disregards that had been set down for that calculation, then my daughter would have been paying the same as a person in Aberdeen. And this is where it's unfair. It's unfair throughout Scotland. And yes, if you want to embellish it because you're a nice council, do so. But you have to use a minimum standard. And that minimum standard is a set of rules, not a set of rules made by councils. Because it certainly is my ball and my rules. And not only do the councils make the rules, but they can change them during the game. And you've got no chance. You're playing a game of a set of rules that started at the beginning of the game, and they're different by the time you're halfway through the first half. There has to be a commonality in how things are charged. That's a necessary. And if it means, I'm not being stupid here, but if it means you've got to rename COSLA, you've got to rename COSLA. Because you need a body who's independent, making up a set of rules and Bible for the councils to adhere to. And the councils within that Bible are being asked to adhere to the minimum. And they can do anything like beyond that. But everybody must be treated the same. Everybody must be treated on the same formula.
One last question to Mr Johnson. Throughout Scotland, if you get a housing benefit, basically it's the same throughout Scotland. On the point that Mr Tate's just made, why should councils be able to charge differently?
I think the answer to that lies in the differences between council areas. As I've said, if you look at a rural council compared to a big city council, there are geographic distances, travel distances, a whole range of factors. And we think that local authorities are best placed to make local decisions, determining how best to allocate scarce resources to meet the needs of their communities. And we would argue strongly that they're directly accountable to their local community for these decisions. As I've said, I think it would be a major step backward. It's interesting that since 2002, the Scottish Parliament has had the power to regulate and has decided not to use that. And we would think that that has been the correct decision for that decade. And as resources get even scarcer, I think it's more important that we have the ability to have local flexibility to make to get more from less and to design services that are efficient, effective, but meeting the needs of local communities.
Thank you.
I'll let you back in, Mr. Tate. I don't know whether anyone else wants to speak on that. Ian Hood.
Yeah, I mean, we in the Learning Alliance Scotland really like this petition because what it calls on is for the Scottish Government to play the role that Mr Tate thinks that a revised COSLA should do. Actually, the Scottish Government has the power, but what we're asking in this petition is simply to review how care charging works across Scotland. Because wherever you look within the care charging system, it's extremely complex, hard to understand. Councillors and council officials don't really understand how the charging is done. And there's a tremendous degree of variation. We've covered a whole range of things within the paper, but I just wanted to mention one at this moment in time. It's the minimum income that councils think that disabled people should have to live on. It varies from £120 in East Ayrshire, a semi-rural area, to £170 in North Lanarkshire, another semi-rural area. There is no real difference between the two areas that justifies that difference. And that pattern happens all the way across Scotland in the exact pick and mix version that Mr Tate said. And that's the real problem here. Why should disabled people in East Ayrshire, or any other one, I've got a list of them here, if you're interested in your own ones, have £120 to live on, and some people have £170. That's not about local democracy. That's about discrimination against people who have disabilities. And what we're asking for is a sense of justice. Because as long as this discrimination takes place, people, whether or not they're paying care charges, feel that it's wrong. And what we would like was a simple system that people can understand so that when they pay charges, and most people will accept that they should pay something, that they feel it's fair, because the same thing happens in Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Motherwell and Kilmarnock.
Why is the guidance not working, COSLA?
I think one of the central motivations behind the more fundamental review that COSLA is currently undergoing, we started it in 2011, and we've made some some substantial changes to the guidance since 2011, but one of the central motivations of that is to achieve greater fairness and to address the issues arising from perceived variation. Now, we appreciate that there is some variation, and there will be some legitimate variation across local authorities in terms of transport costs with sparsity across areas like the Highland. But there may also be some areas where variation is perhaps unwarranted, and we want to try and identify that and reduce any unwarranted variation. The review, as I say, is ongoing, and we have a working group looking at, as Peter just says, right now, with a view to introducing elements that reduced inconsistency across Scottish local authorities, whilst preserving their demographic mandate to vary and tailor services according to the local demographic and need. So we really do take on board these concerns about fairness, the working group are happy to take on board some of this information and see what can be done to improve consistency from the user's perspective, because there are a number of different elements to this, and we focused on charging, but to an extent that is kind of lesser importance, because what matters is the means and the income of each individual who receives care. And a central element of the charging guidance is what's termed a minimum charging threshold, which is based on a number of DWP benefits. Added 16.5% is added to that. Don't ask me about the history of that, but the intention is to establish a minimum income below which people are not charged a penny for the services they receive. If they are above that, then they maybe will contribute a certain amount towards the cost of those charges, but certainly never more than the cost of the service is to deliver. So anyway, to sum that up, yes, we are keen to make this fairer and tackle the points that Ian has just emphasised.
Do the charges relate to the costs of the service? Is this at the heart of this, that people have been paying more than the actual cost of delivery of the service?
You might be interested to know, I mean, Scotland-wide, the overall spend is about 1.4 billion in adult and older people's services, and charges bring in 42 million.
Can I just respond to that? The guidance sets out that a charge should never exceed the cost of providing the service. So just that's a point of clarity in answer to your point there.
Yes, Mr Hood.
Can I just say that sounds all right in theory, and when they work out the charges, it turns out that that's not quite accurate, because the cost for an hour of home care can vary in Scotland between £7.68 and £23 an hour charged by councils. Now, it's actually quite easy to go to a private care company and range an hour of home care for between £10 and £12. In some areas, you can actually get a cheaper service. And many people in Scotland have chosen to do that and have taken themselves out of the social work care system so that they no longer get that. And what we see, really since early 2000, is a declining number of home care clients in Scotland as people have chosen to exit themselves from social care and social work services to buy their own private care, because it's cheaper to do that than it is to have the social work department do that. So it's true that the social work department don't charge you more than the cost of their services, but you can buy cheaper services when you have to pay that yourself. So we actually see a declining number of home care clients across Scotland. Somewhere in the region of 13,000 people have dropped out the care system. Probably more if you adjust that in terms of population. Thanks.
Mr Tate, you tried to get in a couple of times, and then I've got a whole list of people who want to quick.
I have to say that I really do believe that people should be treated on the same formula, whether they live in a farm or in a tenement. It's equality. And the Scottish Parliament, within their own document that they wrote, states that you're looking for fairness. Well, what can be fairer than everybody calculated on the same basis, as opposed to allowing a postcode lottery? You wrote that you want fairness. I think it's laudable. I want fairness. That's all I'm here for. Throughout Scotland, fairness. And whilst the council are allowed to be in charge of this and alter it and play around with it, you will never have fairness, because it's a natural state of mind that if you've got the upper hand, you're going to use it. It's a natural state of mind. And by taking the councils out of making the basic, I don't see why an organisation renamed COSLA can't make a Bible that the councils can use. And beyond that, the councils can have much freedom as they like within their own areas. You're not stifling freedom by putting in fairness.
I'm just on that theme that's emerged today. We've got to be careful that as I have looked at the petition, I don't know whether it's appropriate for this committee actually, be talking about how local government and COSLA, that might even be for another committee. So I think we need to focus on, for this committee's purposes, the question of charging and differential charging, which would be obviously an issue of interest for this committee, who are interested and done work on delivery of care in the community and other years. So we just need to be careful on that. Bob, you wanted a quick clarification on Mr Hood. Vice Convener wants a quick clarification on some of the figures,
yeah, one of the
and
figures,
then I'm going to definitely get to people who ask the question.
Thanks, Convener. Ian, it was in relation, and thanks for bearing to my committee members who were before me in getting in here, but it was on the 13,000 figure you used about people disengaging, if you like, from the traditional format by which local authorities provide care. I'm wondering if you could briefly, hopefully, because I have slightly jumped in asking my question, give a slight breakdown of that, because one interest for this committee would be if people are taking on self-directed support and direct budgets, would they count as someone, would they be part of that 13,000? So if the council's no longer providing a care service for you, but you now have a budget and you're commissioning that yourself, if you like, would that be part of that 13,000, or is that a separate 13,000?
This is part of a bit of work we're doing for a different committee in the Parliament, and it's not quite ready yet. But for your interest, I produced a wee graph today just to show you how this is built. When there's roughly 80,000 home care clients in Scotland in 1998, and by 2012 we're down to 63,000, 64,000. Right? Now, that's long before self-directed support really came into effect, and you can see two things. Once councils were given guidance on how to charge in 1997, it fell away sharply. It went back up with the introduction of free personal care, and as councils tightened and began to charge more, it began to go down again. There may be other reasons for it. We're still working on some of those. So,
for today, but it'd be quite good to get some more information on that at a later
we,
date.
we welcome that information you have, Mr. Hurby. And I'll go quickly now to Rhoda Grant, followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you. From listening to what people are saying, it seems to me that there are minimum standards in place, but the minimum standards for charging are maybe not altogether fair. If we've got a minimum income guarantee, but councils are then putting in their own income guarantee on top of it. Can I ask maybe, because I think we've kind of talked about the issues and kind of in the hope of finding a solution, can I ask COSLA about the working group that is reviewing consistency of charging? Are service users involved in that? How can service users, you know, I understand that service user can't be part of COSLA, but surely COSLA is used in kind of its normal local authority role to consult and work with service users. How are they involved in this review?
Indeed, yes. The working group itself, as Peter has said, is trying to go forward on a co-productive basis, and the membership comprises representatives from a wide range of stakeholders. I don't think we have an individual service user on it, but we have representatives from Age Scotland, the Coalition of Carers, Inclusion Scotland, Alzheimer's Scotland, Scottish Consortium for Learning Disabilities, Independent Living Project Scotland and Capability Scotland, as well as a number of representatives from local authorities themselves. So it's a fairly wide membership base, I think, but happy to consider any suggestions which will broaden this out to serve the purpose of achieving greater consistency.
What is your hope for the outcome of the review? What do you hope it achieves? I mean, I understand that COSLA wants local decision-making protected to an extent, but I think you hear the petitioner and Ian who'd talk about the huge disparity, which looks and feels very, very unequal.
Well, I think I don't think we were set up to have a final report per se. We undertook a public consultation in 2011, which comprised a listening event and contributions from the general public and a range of disabled people's organisations, and quickly formed this working group. Now, it didn't really take a lot of time to come up with a set of outcomes which we felt were sort of worthwhile to progress to improve the guidance. And this set of outcomes, there are 8 outcomes essentially, they're set out in the charging guidance themselves. So these outcomes are around things like partners' income, understanding information, facilitating movement, so that's portability of care, benchmarking across councils so that we can reduce this variation, financial assessment, treatment of disability-related expenditure, which we're hoping to include a revision to the guidance for April next year. So, I mean, this sort of informs where we want to go with the work. I don't know whether you have a copy of the charging guidance, but I can see that you get a full copy of those outcomes that we're heading towards. Yeah. And touching on a point that was made earlier, we are sort of trying to look at the user perspective and improve consistency from the user perspective. So we're doing a little bit of work around financial assessment with a view to maybe developing a standard financial assessment template, which would go some way towards improving fairness, I think, and incorporate that within the guidance.
Can I ask about the status of the guidance? Is the guidance, are all COSLA members tied into the guidance? Will they sign up to it? Will that become universal? Or is it simply guidance and councils can pick and mix, I think, to coin the phrase?
On all issues, COSLA can issue guidance, but it comes down to individual local authorities whether they accept that guidance or not, although clearly each local authority is bound to follow the law. But within that framework, they have absolute flexibility.
Okay. Is there any way then the guidance can be strengthened to, and given that COSLA is an association of local authorities, could they take the decision that every local authority would adhere to that guidance to give some kind of, I suppose, confidence that it would work? I know budgets are tight, and I know, local authorities are struggling to make ends meet, and care is a big part of the budget. But if I suppose on one side we have legislation that we can implement and change all this. That then takes that control away from individual councils. If councils were to maybe look at signing up and policing themselves to an extent, that could create fairness and strengthen any guidance that was coming out.
I think what COSWA tries to do in terms of issuing guidance is to make sure that it's highlighting best practice, that it's showing the way forward. But we do recognise that at the end of the day, it does come down to the judgment of each council as to whether they accept that guidance or not. And COSWA has no powers to enforce guidance on local authorities.
Final question. From your members, are you receiving any kind of thinking or any signals that should the guidance be produced that they would sign up to it and implement it, or is it just going to wither on the vine?
Well, I suppose the process for agreeing COSWA guidance includes every council leader in Scotland, and having signed up to that guidance at that level, we would certainly expect that there would be a local sign-up on the back of that. But as I say, it does come down to individual councils having the right to determine their view.
And there is no way, there is no prior incidents of COSLA having jointly come forward with guidance where they agreed to be bound by it?
Well, I think the process of COSWA agreeing guidance is jointly carried out with our membership with local authorities. Local authorities are represented in the Health and Wellbeing Executive Group. All 32 councils send representatives to that. So if you're looking at how this guidance is produced, it's the elected representatives of councils in the Health and Wellbeing Group who agree the guidance. And then that is approved further up the decision-making chain at COSWA by the COSWA Leaders Forum. And if necessary, it would go to the COSWA Convention. And it's the COSWA membership who agree the guidance. So in one level, there's complete sign-up for that. But the point I'm making is that once that has been done, it does come down to individual local authorities to implement that.
There is no... sorry, can I just ask one final question? Yeah. But there is no comeback to a service user who sees the guidance, says, this works for me, this looks fair. Their council have signed up to the guidance but haven't implemented it. There is no comeback, there is no redress, there is no appeal.
There are internal council appeals procedures leading right up to social work complaints body that would come in front of local elected members to determine whether things have been done properly. And then, of course, out with the council, once the internal appeals procedure has been completed, there is the route to the local government ombudsman, if necessary. But certainly, very few issues end up going down that route. And we would hope that matters could be resolved with meetings with the individual service user, and if necessary, the local elected member fighting their corner, and could be resolved internally within the local authority. But I'm not aware, in fact, there is no basis for a complaint being upheld on the basis that the COSWA guidance says X and the council are doing Y. That wouldn't be a reason to uphold that.
These guidelines could be strengthened through the Scottish Government legislating to strengthen the actual guidelines. So the question is not, I mean, necessarily that one. What is the extent of councils breaching their own guidelines? I suppose, you know, Mr. Tate's experience, you know, as he's described it earlier, has said, well, they change the rules midstream. They, you know, there are guidelines there that they're not applying. And what is it? You know, if COSLA take this seriously, what analysis has been carried out? What monitoring takes place to establish where the problem areas? I presume that's, you know, the process of review. If you agree something as leaders, when it gets back, they say, well, no, that doesn't work or whatever. What's the extent of breach of the guidelines?
Well, we run an annual survey of non-residential social care charges, and we have done some preliminary analysis. And in terms of the charges themselves, the tariff of charges, the variation isn't huge. There are a handful of outliers which Ian has just emphasised. And, you know, if there's unwarranted variation around that, we want to try and have a look at it. But a lot of the time, it's quite difficult to compare. We're comparing apples with pears because a service specification in one local authority for I don't know, for home care may differ significantly from another. For example, one might include the cost of transport, one might not. One might include lunches, one might not. But anyway, generally speaking, the variation isn't huge, I would argue, but there are some significant outliers. But on the other hand of it, in terms of how much individuals pay for the services they receive, we are looking at bringing this standard financial assessment template in to bring a bit of fairness and consistency around that. So I think I'd have to come back with you some more detailed information if you wanted the full extent of the variation. But I mean, there have been, a couple of years ago, I think there was some information in the public domain about really huge variation. And I don't think that is the general picture.
Mr. Hood, trying to catch my eye there. Do you necessarily agree that there's not much variation?
A lot of variation. We did a wee spreadsheet called the Universal Calculator, which actually went through the different local authority charges, and anyone could come along and use it. It was online for a while, and you could just type in how much income you had, what your expenditure was, and actually, didn't matter what you picked. You had huge variations in any service, from home care to very sheltered housing to daycare, huge variation. But the point I really wanted to make was on Rhoda Grant's, I think, very important point about actually what could happen with this guidance. And I think that really the COSLA guidance, actually it's an interesting document. There's a number of things that could be tightened up with it. But actually there's nothing to stop the Scottish Government using the powers that it already has to set a national thing to adopt, in effect, the COSLA guidance and give it that backbone that COSLA itself can't actually do. Because COSLA can only say, we would like you to do it, but you can't. Right? It's up to you. The Scottish Government has the powers. It took them in 2002 to set this, and it doesn't have to do a whole lot of work. It just says, well, COSLA, you've come up with a good policy. We like it. Make it work.
Okay, well, I mean, it does seem to me that it's very hard to disagree with the thrust of the petition in terms of a review of how care charges work. But, I mean, personally, I would go further than that and have a great deal of sympathy for what William Tate and Ian Hood are saying. Now, obviously, I was the minister who brought in the legislation in 2002, so I think that suggests to me that there is no principled objection to having regulations. Clearly, COSLA were given a chance to produce guidance, and they've been doing that for 10 years. But the evidence to me that we've heard today seems to me suggest that that approach has failed. So I would certainly be minded to support regulations. Now, I suppose there's two questions for me in all of this. If we're not going to have regulations, you know, how could the guidance potentially be made more effective? My first question was going to be about enforcement powers, but we've already heard from COSLA that there are none, so I don't need to ask that question. And that seems to me to be the fundamental flaw in the guidance and the fundamental reason why the guidance has failed and we need regulations. But of course, the second point is about how the guidance could be improved. And now Ian Hood has suggested that the guidance could be translated into regulations, but clearly if that's to happen, it has to be effective guidance. So I suppose my main question is, how could the content of the guidance be improved? I was concerned when Garrick Smith suggested, I may have misunderstood him, but it seemed to me the bedrock of the guidance was establishing a minimum income, and beyond that people could charge what they like, provided it wasn't more than the cost of the service. So I suppose my question would be, you know, even if you don't agree with my conclusion about regulations, how can we make this guidance more effective and more fit for purpose? So the Learning Disability Alliance has raised the issue of the minimum income and the disability-related expenditure. So that's two areas, I suppose, that could be improved. So if Ian Hood perhaps could elaborate on that and any other ways. I mean, you've suggested that you would quite like the guidance to be turned into regulations, but what improvements would you like to see happen before that takes place?
There's a number. I mean, people are quite happy to make a contribution towards their care. I mean, personally, I don't think people should have to make a contribution towards getting out of bed in the morning. I think that should be a bit of a human right. However, some people are quite happy to make that contribution, and the suggestions that we've had for people who would like to find a way of changing is the minimum income, to have that standard £170. Many people with learning disabilities actually get state benefits of income support in excess of £170 because of their disability, up to £186 a week. Yet, even though the state says you need that to live on, local council says that's too much. The one thing that people have said is a cap on charges. A number of local councils, for example Falkirk, say the maximum that you have to pay in a single week is £23.90. Other councils say £45. But some councils can charge whatever they want. We did a freedom information survey earlier this year and discovered that one council claimed that they'd actually charged somebody £564 for a single week's service. Right? I think a cap of £23.90 or as in Wales, £50 sets a limit. You know, it's still a lot of money, but actually it says that there's a limit to what people should have to pay. The standard financial assessment, which Garrick talks about, is an important step forward, so people would have a standard way of doing that. We think it should include the costs that people have for disability-related expenditure, which can vary from holidays to the cost of washing and changing sheets, you know, to actually the extra cost of fuel. These are things which are actually well already within council's powers. They use it as part of the discretionary housing payment system when they go through people in detail and ask them what they spend on things. There's no reason it couldn't be part of the care charging system. And finally, there's a question mark about people who already pay charges towards things like the Independent Living Fund, which has got its own question marks, but the people already pay towards those charges. And it should be clear that people are already paying something towards their care. They shouldn't have to pay a second time towards that. So I think those three things, caps and charges, a minimum income, and a standard financial assessment allowing for disability-related expenditure, would be three things that would make it a much fairer system. You know, the levels are always an argument.
Okay, that was very helpful. Now, if I could ask Cosla then, particularly about the cap on charges. I mean, you justified the significant variation in terms of different circumstances in council areas, particularly perhaps geographic, although that was challenged by Ian Hood. But I wonder what argument you could use against having a cap, because even if it was more expensive to deliver, say, in a very rural area like the Highlands, would there not still be a case for having a cap on the charge? Because why should somebody pay twice as much or three times as much in a rural area than in an urban area?
I think the fundamental thing we have to say is that councils establish the specification of the service, they work out the cost of the service, and then they charge for the service they provide on a whole range of local circumstances. But they certainly take into account the service users' financial circumstances. Our data shows that charges are broadly similar across Scotland. There's not extreme variations. There are some examples of that, of variation, but the amount actually charged may actually be lower than the council's tariff because of the financial assessment that councils make, not on a computer but face-to-face with an individual. The COSWA Charging Guidance Working Group has actively considered this issue of national regulation. And we have rejected that, not just on the basis of the fact that it would take away local decision-making, and it would certainly be a return to ring fencing, which Scottish local authorities would not welcome and would be vehemently opposed to, but also because it would have a financial impact on national government, and also could, we believe, lead to more people having to pay than are currently paying. So it's not just an upside to regulation, there is a big downside to national regulation which we feel should be taken into account. And we believe that at this moment in time, the best way forward is to allow local authorities working through COSWA and working with our... We're not excluding service users, we're keen to engage with them absolutely in determining the best way forward. And as I said earlier, regulation would limit the ability of local authorities to prioritise local resources. If you're ring-fencing an amount for adult and social care services, saying this cannot be touched, that leaves another part of the budget of local authorities that has to be raided to pay for things like that. It raises a whole new dimension. It will stop local flexibility, which flies full in the face of what is happening through the public bodies joint working, where the Parliament is discussing and actively looking to have local flexibility determine how local integrated services are going to be delivered. Now, to go down that route, which we absolutely applaud in COSLA, and at the same time look to impose something on local authorities in terms of charging, just doesn't join together and make logical sense, we would argue. But I think Garrick might have a bit more of the detail to go into.
Well, not so much detail. I mean, I will pick up on the idea of capping has been discussed in outline by the working group, although my thinking around it and any sort of further development and detail around that has not been thought through yet, but I mean, that is something that can be discussed. But if I can pick up on a couple of points that Ian made earlier around disability-related expenditure, yes, we've identified that as an area which has had some uncertainty through its omission in the guidance, and that is something we propose to introduce for the guidance for 2014. Albeit subject to leaders' approval, but we're hoping to get something a bit more substantive around that to give a bit of consistency and ensure that local authorities are a little bit more proactive around disregarding disability-related expenditure. Treatment of partners' income is another element which you could say would comprise part of standard financial assessment template. And just to say, I'd welcome Ian's contribution to the work of the group in terms of his information that he's able to provide now and ongoing.
Well, last question. I mean, we could have excuse me, a long discussion about the contents of any guidance or regulations, which we haven't got time to do now. But let's just take your existing guidance with any revisions that are made from the group that's working on it just now, so that will be guidance that was accepted by COSLA. Why should that not be translated into regulations? Because the fundamental problem of the guidance, whatever its content is that there is no means of enforcing it, and therefore, you know, people could say it's not worth the paper that it's written on. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but unless there is some enforcement powers, how are people going to have any confidence in whatever revised guidance that you come up with?
I think I'd have to defer to Peter's response on that.
I suppose the difference between guidance and regulation is that guidance allows for some flexibility. And for those of us who are at the chalk face of delivering these services, local flexibility can be vital to improving services and, as I said, getting more from less, whereas regulation can be too stifling. And we believe that working with councils on a voluntary basis through guidance is the best way to proceed and protects local democracy, but also delivers better local services.
Okay, we'll leave it there just now.
Gil Patterson.
Thanks so much. I'll put my question to Mr. Tate. I know that your petition is not specific to your own circumstances and your daughter's circumstances. And in a question from the convener, when you're talking about pick and mix, you gave us an indication that I wasn't quite clear about, that you had applied or pressure was being put on for charges to be made. I'm not sure entirely if that succeeded and you were made to pay it. And
It didn't succeed.
It
didn't succeed because it withered away. It got to the stage of final appeal, and I think because the council had never had a final appeal, it withered away. But my point was that the formula or the basic disregards that COSLA said should have been heeded in the basic formulation, they had disregarded a disregard which artificially inflated the charge against my daughter. And that to me was reprehensible, and I don't think you should be disregarding disregards that COSLA say should be there, because it's artificially making money for the council and it's taking valuable money away from a disabled autistic person.
But eventually that didn't happen. That's what
the charge didn't happen, but right. You know, I'm not here to talk personally, but we're away again. They seem to want to, they're desperate to get me. And this one's been going on for a year, and we're still fighting this new one. So it's because they've got there's nobody to say enough's enough. We're going to investigate this. that councils are free to do this, and I don't believe I'm a special case. I genuinely believe this is happening throughout Scotland, absolutely throughout Scotland. And people have different abilities to fight it. Some can't fight it and they capitulate, and others can fight it. But the stress and anxiety of having a fight of over a year's in duration is just ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And it's because, and if I just may quickly say, I think, and it may be simplistic, but it should be COSLA rules or COSLA regulations, take the guidelines away, and then you start to introduce fairness. But whilst it's, there you go, do what you like with them, because COSLA's doing a lot of work on this template. It's of no use. That council can use it and that council can't. You know, it's pointless unless it goes away from guidelines. They have to do it. You know, it has to be, and you're quite right.
I know that, and you do say that it's not the personal aspect of it, and you're looking to the actual system that's in place. And feel free not to answer this, because I'm going to ask you a personal question. I'm trying to understand what the service was that was being provided, not the actual cost, but what service was being provided that you were being asked to pay for.
My daughter's an independent living.
Yes.
And they came along with another charge, non-residential care accommodation charge. I think that's what it was called. Never heard of it. The first time we were told about it was a letter of charge on the doorstep. So there was no face-to-face, as COSLA suggests. They just banged these letters out to everybody. Just as the same as many years ago in the calculation of respite nights. They just halved the respite nights without telling anybody. And just wrote to everybody and said, here's your respite nights now. And people were taken aback because it's half. It's this cavalier, loose cannon attitude that councils operate under. That has to be stopped. And I don't believe that putting regulations in stops it. Will hinder it, because you put your regulations in to build a good basic foundation. And once that basic foundation is there, the council, quite rightly, operate within their area as they need to do.
Richard, did you want a supplementary here, because I've got Bob?
I think actually I was quite interested, Mr. Tate. Mr. Campbell has never had an opportunity to say anything, and I'd be very interested in his view as a service manager, financial inclusion for North Lanarkshire Council. On the comments made by Mr. Tate, where would your council stand?
Okay, just in the sense of the financial assessment, because we've been highlighted as being the £170. We certainly, I'm a member of the review group in COSLA, and I have been for quite a while. And North Lanarkshire Council is committed to following the guidance that COSLA issues regarding the charging policy. Although we are slightly different in the sense that our £170 is made up of pension credits plus the 16.5% buffer, and we apply that rule to everybody who receives a non-residential service. Other councils will use the benefit rates for somebody aged between 18 to 24, 25 to 59 or 61 now because of the change in the pension age, and then also maybe we'll have 3 different levels, but that will be obviously dependent on the makeup of their council area, you know, and obviously the demand and the need for service, and some of the issues that Garrick had mentioned earlier. But I suppose the other thing that I would say, I mean, it's not just the threshold, the £120 or £170. We also disregard obviously rent and council tax costs, you know, so that taper can be higher than the £170 if there are any rent and council tax costs. Some occasions it's just the water rates that people are liable for, so we would obviously disregard that as well, because we don't want to leave them in a position where they're unable to live. So in our mean, our policy is based on people's ability to pay rather than the cost of the service, you know, so the cost of service is really in many cases irrelevant. Unless you do get only an hour's service, you know, you could have an assessment and it says, oh, you've got an ability to pay £28, but you're only getting an hourly service, 1 hour a week service, so obviously we wouldn't charge you that £28, we would charge you the hourly rate of the service, you know, so I think our policy is fair, it's equitable, and, you know, and it's based on your ability to pay.
Based on the fact that you're an official who actually works this system, do you think that that it should be still left to councils to implement, or do you believe in the point that Mr Tate has made that it should be brought back to the Scottish Government?
I think it should be left to local authorities. I think it's, you know, it's local discretion, you know, local needs, local demands. I mean, and obviously again, it's difficult from a North Lanarkshire perspective and, you know, as an officer of the council, because our policy, I think, is fair, you know, but I think, you know, we would like to be the ones making the decision of what our policy should look like, you know, what should be disregarded, what shouldn't be disregarded, define the COSLA guidance, you know, and how actually, you know, we can actually... Part of the COSLA guidance for ANSI is it has an income maximisation side of it. So it says before you charge, you should maximise people's income. And, you know, in North Lanarkshire in 2011-12, for the people who were assessed for non-residential services, we generated benefits of income for them of £6 million. But ultimately, the charging policy at that time only brought in £800,000. So there was £5.2 million went into directly into people's pockets, do you know? And I think, I'm not saying that that couldn't be part of the regulation. I don't know if you'd get away with putting that, for say, as a regulation, you know, an actual service, do you know, as a regular. I'm not too sure how that would really fit, do you know? But I believe it should be left to local authorities.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I think I've got another couple of questions, and then, you know, we need to make progress. Nanette Millen and Bob Doris.
Just I'm interested in what you're saying about developing a standard financial assessment template. You say that's a medium-term aspiration. Where are you with it? What's the sort of timing? And could you also elaborate? There's a paragraph in your submission just about being a more challenging piece of work. And so if you just maybe elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, I think our intention is to firm up our thinking and proposals around a standard financial assessment in the new year. We plan to do some costing information around this, so to find out, you know, how much it will cost local authorities to align with a standard financial assessment template. I think that will be needed to inform leaders' decision making around this before they make any kind of commitment towards signing up to that. There is another element which comes into play, and that is around tapers, and that is the maximum amount that's, which local authorities can take of residual income in paying for social care costs as a charge. And I think we need to do a bit of challenging work around that. That's what the challenge refers to.
It's relatively short term. You said medium term, but it should be early next year. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Anyone else want to add to that response, Mr Hood?
Yes, just very briefly. I mean, I think the tapers question is incredibly important in terms of the thing. The taper is in effect how much after the financial assessment of your spare income goes towards charges. And it varies in Scotland from 15% in Orkneys to 100% in half a dozen councils. And the idea that as a tax rate, when the tax that we have on the richest people in our society is 40%, that it's okay to take 100% of the spare income, I think Garrick underestimates the real problem that there is in getting councils to be able to shift this. Because if you bring it down to an average level, some councils will lose out quite dramatically from that. And this is part of the problem. How do we balance the change that will happen from a standard policy in councils down who will lose out? And that's, on our side, we're concerned that people will end up having to pay more and cause us worried about whether or not some councils won't be able to balance their books. This is a real difficulty, and I have no answer to that problem, you know, but I know which side I'm on.
Bob Doris, I think, for our last questions.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Perhaps a brief comment and then a more substantive question. I don't want to pick away any more at the quite complex issues that you've started to deal with, but I am sympathetic to the idea of a minimum income, and the tapering issue just reflects how complicated that is, also having to take into account UK benefits, which are under a dramatic period of change at the moment, and what those UK benefits are supposed to sustain you in being able to do and what they're not, and what local authorities are supposed to sustain an individual being able to do and what they're not, and that whole relationship between a UK benefit system, the Scottish Government and local authorities and assessed care needs. I think it's murky at best, quite frankly, so I don't want to go do anything else other than say I'm fairly convinced that the idea of a minimum income commitment, but I'm not sure how we get there given the complexities, but I just wanted to put that on the record. I also wanted to put on the record that some of this will be dependent on the resource allocation each local authority puts in, and that's a political priority. And some local authorities put far more resource allocations into this area than others, and I won't name names, but they clearly do. So there is a local political priorities, and it's on local political priorities that I actually wanted to address my questions in relation to. Mr Hood talked about a freedom of information request to get some charging information. I would have thought that in terms of transparency, there should be an annual outturn for every local authority in terms of their charging regime. For example, I represent constituents in Glasgow and I represent constituents in South Lanarkshire. I'll use maybe a seemingly trivial example. Some local authorities will charge people to get their grass cut, some won't. Some people will charge £2, some people will charge £15. I would like to know for my local authority, if I was having that service, am I the most expensive out of the 32 in Scotland? Do I get it for free? Am I the least expensive? How close am I to the least expensive? An idea of transparency. So in terms of the charging regimes that exist across all local authorities, do you think COSLA might give consideration? Because these are local decisions. I would want to know as a constituent, if I'm the most expensive local authority, if I'm getting the highest charges out of any local authority, I think my council should have a duty to tell me that when they charge me, because I think politically that would focus the minds of all the politicians at local authority level, irrespective of which parties they represent. Many of the MSPs here will travel across the country at various by-elections, and depending on which part of the country you're in, care charges are used as a political football. But the reality is sometimes it's a Labour authority, sometimes it's an SNP authority, sometimes it's a coalition authority. It shouldn't matter. I just want to know vis-à-vis every other local authority in the country, what are my care charges? Am I the most expensive? Am I the least expensive? Am I the average? Because when I then go to the ballot box as a constituent at the next election, I can make a decision as to whether the local priorities that my council has set are appropriate ones for the type of local authority area I want to see. So I would like some information from the COSLA representatives in terms of how readily available is that information. Are there agreed areas that you could focus on? And how would you feel about making that a duty in every local authority to say, where are you vis-à-vis the other 31 local authorities in the country?
I can respond in terms of the information that's available. I mentioned earlier we run an annual survey that collects information around what each local authority charges for their care services, and that now is available on the COSLA website. It is a little bit complex, and it probably could benefit from maybe a reformatting or a consideration of how we can make that more publicly accessible in terms of not just viewing the data, but digesting the data. We've also, over the past couple of years, encouraged local authorities to submit their local charging policies to COSLA so that we also have council charging policies on a web page in the consular website. But again, we may need to look at that to see whether it can be more user friendly in terms of presenting that information. So yeah, I mean, it's positive steps, and I think information and availability of it in terms of providing clarity and transparency is one of the key outcomes set out for the work of the working group, who incidentally Scottish Government civil servants are included on the working group as we take this forward.
So I was just wondering, I was specifically asking whether or not you believe local authorities should have a duty to tell their residents where they rank amongst other local authorities for charging. So if it's if you are charging an individual for a sleepover from social care staff, if one local authority is charging individuals £10, another one is charging £20, that would give you a ranking position. Now, I take into account what you're saying in relation to income disregards and tapering and everything else. I take all that into account, but COSLA could do a piece of work in order to equalise this so they can report in a standard format so you can get that contrast. I think in terms of local democracy, that would be effective. How do you feel about taking forward a piece of work in relation to that?
As an officer, in principle, I think it's fine. I think we've got the information there. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine in principle. I don't know whether Peter wants to make any kind of comment around that.
I think it would have an interesting political dimension. Politicians don't often put into the public domain and through every letterbox in their area adverse information regarding their own political decisions. I think the information, as Garrick is saying, is available. COSLA has a whole range of benchmarking for local authorities. There's just a caveat that sometimes you're not comparing like with like. I mean, if you take the grass cutting example, if you pay £10 to get your grass cut, well, you would pay an annual bill. How many cuts do you get? Are you comparing apples and apples or apples and pears? So that has to be looked at. But there's also the reality that costs vary on a whole range of things across Scotland. The council tax is different in 32 local authorities. I've not heard anyone arguing that the council tax should be exactly the same in every single local authority. And that's pretty fundamental to local government finance. I mean, the cost of a pint of milk varies in every local authority area, and nobody's arguing that that should be standardised. So I think honesty and transparency are very dear principles, and we would certainly expect local authorities to be honest and straightforward. And certainly the examples we've had of decisions being made without appropriate local consultation, COSLA would not seek to defend. That's indefensible. We expect full participation and involvement in users before charges are implemented, not after. And that's fundamental to the work we're looking to do. But essentially we come back to the point we're making that we believe these decisions are best left locally so that we get the best value, we get the best local services, and we get services that are best attuned to local needs.
Convener, no further questions. Just to point out that I heard Councillor Johnson give a number of caveats, which I completely accept, that we can't be that simplistic, but I think I did hear some mood music around it's something that consideration might be given to how we can make it more open to the individuals that we all represent. So thank you very much for that.
At this point, I think the session this morning has been very useful in terms of the committee's point of view. We've had some initial evidence. Obviously, we'll return to this petition after we reflect on some of that evidence. And, you know, thank you in advance for the information that you have promised and the information that's available. That would also help our considerations. Can I thank you all for your attendance this morning, the time that you have given and the evidence provided. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are we suspending or just carrying on? We'll just carry on, I think. No, Brian. We'll suspend for a few moments then. We now move to agenda item 6. Yeah, it is 6.
No, 5. 6, sorry.
What's wrong? On my brief it says 6, or is it 5? No, it's 6. Agenda item number 6, which is to approve the specification for an advisor to assist us in scrutiny of the Assisted Suicide Scotland Bill. This is required in order to, for us to, we need to do this in order for us to get permission from the Parliamentary Bureau for an advisor appointment. The papers before you in terms of the advisor and what we'd expect from the remit and etc. Is there any comments on the specification as it's laid out in the paper before you?
Specifically, but having been on the committee that looked at the previous bill, I presume the specifications for the advisor for that bill were looked at as well, taken into consideration. Thank you. I'm getting a nod from Jude. That's fine.
Okay. So we agree to move with that on the... Okay, agreed. As previously agreed, we are now moving on to agenda item number 7, which is in private, as normal with discussions on our work programme.